Regular board meeting. And recording is in progress. Okay, let's see on the agenda we've got today. Start out with we want to do the consent agenda. So I'm sure you've all had a chance to read the material in that. I'll be looking for a motion to approve the consent agenda items this morning.
So moved.
And there's a second.
Second.
Very good. All in favor, signify by aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed or abstentions? Hearing none, we'll move on. So with that, I'd like to offer an opportunity for members to address the board or make comments at this time. Krista, do we got any here?
I think we do. Yeah, everybody's quiet listening
Good.
today. So yeah, we'll keep going.
Okay, what do we got next on the agenda here this morning? Okay, Foster, I believe you're up.
Yeah, we have, this is our rate study that we're going to be doing throughout, kind of between now and probably September leading into our 2026 budget. So we really want to get our rate analysis done, completed. This is our kind of a good checkpoint for us. We've done two things. We've done a cost of service analysis, and we're in the final stage of completing that cost of service, and that's what's before you today. And what we do is the cost of service really says, what is the cost to provide power to our utility? Now, it's very different on how we collect the revenue. That's the retail rate. This is really what the cost of service is. And what we do is we've hired a consultant, very industry prevalent and wonderful consultant, E3, that has helped us. I don't know if Paul is here or not, but if he hasn't joined, he may join us in a little bit to answer any questions that we have. But let me try to go through it. The cost of service analysis that we have is to assign those cost buckets. Remember, as a cooperative utility, we're obligated to have the members pay their portion of what their burden is on the cooperative. And so if you use a lot of energy, you have to pay accordingly. If you are a less user, then you pay less, and so forth. But it's based on a cost causation model, and the cost of service is where you start. And based on the cost of service, we have grouped those into, I'll call them buckets. And the buckets that we have are kind of the rate classes for residential, for commercial, for pumps. For us, it's fairly easy. We don't have a lot of institutional loads or any of the things that some of the folks have on the mainland. So our cost of service analysis that we have before you today is pretty easy. It really just assigns whatever those cost buckets are. And then as we're concluding the cost of service, what we're going to do is we're going to be kicking off the tariff process. And that's how to collect the revenue that goes along with the cost of service analysis. Russell, do you want to touch on anything on the cost of service? I know it's fairly consistent with what we did last year. If you want to go to the next page.
Also, Paul's here, Foster.
Oh, good. That's good to know.
Yep.
Anything you want to touch on, Russell?
So, and this is just showing how our costs may have shifted over the years, or our, maybe cost allocations may have driven cost in different categories from residential to, say, commercial, or vice versa. So there's nothing alarming here, but just coming right along with the study and making sure they're allocated to the appropriate user, making sure that we're using up-to-date and accurate methodologies for how we use our system right now and how our members use our system.
Yeah, so if you want to go into the detail, just really quick on this chart, this is a summary chart. There's a detail in the appendix, and you'll see that there's a comparison to the cost study of the cost allocations for 2018. So on the left, what you see is how is our cost of service allocated, our revenue requirements allocated in 2018, and then how is it updated or reviewed by E3, and you kind of see the differences pretty darn close. Now every time that you get a different provider or consultant that's involved, you get a little bit of adjustments and so forth based on the methodology. So it's good to know that we're fairly consistent there. On the right side, you're going to see the on the kind of the dollars that go along with it as a comparison, and you can see how those allocations are a little bit up and down. Some of it has to do with the time value of money in the 2018-19. If you dig in deep, I mean 2018 versus 2025. Sorry, if you dig in deep into the appendix.
Foster, could you comment a little bit on the decline in commercial, especially large commercial? Is that because we have less large commercial now, or have they become more efficient and many of them have their own rooftop solar, et cetera? What accounts for the shift in allocation on commercial?
I want to make sure that we're concentrating on the left side right now. Russell, why don't you touch on the left side graph?
Yeah, that's where I'm talking about.
Paul, you want to jump in real quick? Paul from E3 is actually on the call.
Oh, good. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, on the chart on the left, you can see in the blue bars is showing the allocation of costs in the updated 2025 numbers. And the gold bar is showing the allocation percentages from 2018. So there certainly have been some shifts in the allocation over the last 7 or so years. And there's a number of factors there. And you can actually see that sub bullet below the chart calls out some of the factors too. And so one, there's changes in the expenditures over time. There's also as Foster mentioned, with updating this allocation process, there were a few tweaks in the different allocators that we used to assign costs to different customer classes. And also there, of course, have been changes in the actual customer class determinants over time, with growth in the residential class, for example, contributing to higher allocation to the residential class relative to other classes.
So as we've seen for instance, the growth of work from home, there's a little more residential, a little less commercial overall, and that attributes to that shift a good bit.
Paul, is it safe to say that since the residential went up, it really came from the large and small commercial?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. I think there was a question in the chat about the pump.
So Rick asked, what is the pump category? Those are well services, and we do actually have classes for commercial and residential, but based on usage profiles, things like that. They don't from a overall classification, they look very similar. It only attributes to a very small percentage of our system. These services can require a separate meter. I mean, that doesn't mean you have to, but if the sole usage on that meter is a well pump or a desalination system, things like that, that's where they fall.
So we have a community water system with dedicated wells, and we fall into that category, for example, Rick, because we.
Yeah.
And is there any agricultural in that category as well, Russell?
I'm sure there may be. I haven't
small.
analyzed down. Yeah, it's very small.
Yeah,
Very
I don't really
We don't
think
have a lot of irrigation things.
we don't have any irrigation to speak of like they do on the east
Right,
side.
sure.
So I don't think you're going to see that in the pumps. Those are really just residential.
Gotcha.
Any other questions?
Am I allowed to speak? I'm not sure what rules of the road are here.
Absolutely. Why don't you ask your questions?
All right, so I want to make a comment and a question. So in looking at the 2025 rate allocations, basically we were discussing earlier that, small and large commercial has increased and residential has gone down. In my assessment, I would say that this is more of a cost shift than a change in rates, because when the commercial businesses, of which I run a commercial business, when our utility costs go up, of course, we have to increase our fees, our prices on things, and so on. So it's really just shifting from the residential market to the commercial market, but the consumer on the island generally is paying about the same, I would guess. I wondered if you had any comment on that.
May I clarify something? If you look at the labeling on that, the gold or the ladder bar is actually the 2018 study. So the shift is from commercial to residential.
I was looking at the 2025. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that we had moved to that. The 2025 shows, in my mind, a reasonably strong shift from residential over to commercial. Or am I misreading that?
Right, and that is the blue is the rate, the cost allocation. The green is how we're currently collecting. So if we do change ours to the cost allocations in the COSA, that would be a shift lower to commercial and higher to residential, just slightly.
Yes.
But that's because residential dominates our usage.
Sure. I guess my point is that moving the cost allocation between residential and commercial effectively says that island residents are paying or will be paying roughly the same. It's just how it's collected, either through a commercial operation where prices are higher, or through their residential, which by this chart looks like prices are lower. That's my point.
Yeah, let me try to clarify. I think you're on it. I think you have a good point here. Is we're just looking at the amount of burden that the system creates and how to assign that burden, if you will.
Yes.
It's not really zero or net neutral when it comes to the dollars. It's really assigning who gets what allocation of what the total system is. And then what we do is we try to figure out what we do in the tariff side, we figure out how to collect that amount of revenue. So, but you're right. It's a net neutral analysis that we look at, but we try to appropriately burden where the burden is due, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's my point. It's net. I don't know if it's exactly net neutral, but it's in that general vein. So folks that are saying, "Oh, look, my residential went down," I've shifted the cost, or the cost has shifted in some way over to the commercials. That's good. I like that. In effect, when you go to the grocery store or you rent offices or whatever, some portion of that is paying for the energy use increases, or however it works out.
Yeah, I think you got a good understanding. Thanks for that. It's going to be hard for us to communicate that. So
it is.
Thanks for the wisdom.
And as a commercial property owner, among other things, when I unfortunately have to raise my office rates, I always list, utilities as one of the things that has gone up, at a reasonably good clip. And of course, people say, well, that's okay, but why am I paying for that? Well, because the total cost of the product includes utilities.
Right. You've got a good understanding.
Foster, there's a question in the chat.
From Wendy.
Oh, Wendy, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and unmute?
Right. I was asking a question I think you just answered, which is I was wondering why the essentially fees being paid by the small businesses were higher than the fees being paid by the large businesses. But I think you answered the question. Thank you.
You got it. Good questions on the COSA.
Yeah, Foster, I got one, and maybe Brian may want to kick in too. I had a discussion with him yesterday, and I don't know if we're going to cover this later or not, but it seems like the tariff structures that we've got were inherited literally going back to 1937 and haven't changed much. And I kind of asked the question, what is it about on the other side of the distribution transformer? What is unique about a specific connection that invokes a higher or lower cost associated with it? And I think we're seeing, we're living a legacy of stuff that was passed down from RUS or the 1937 days or something like this, where there's a fair amount of social engineering that was built into these structures as opposed to, pure cost allocation. And I don't know, I've never really understood, what is it that, why is large commercial charged higher? I mean, there must be some unique characteristics that could say, well, to provide electric power to this particular meter requires X additional services or capacity or equipment or something else like that. So are we incorporating that in our thinking going forward?
So
Yeah,
I'm going to add something to the question. It'd be great that we have an expert here from E3. So, because I've always wondered about this since I came into the co-op, because within the classes, whether it's industrial or residential, they're very different in how people use their electricity, a lot or little. And in fact, we actually have some residential customers who probably used more than industrial. So, what's the value of the COSA step at this point? Why do we do COSA and then do the rate design? And I'm wondering, do other utilities do it differently now?
Why don't I take a run at that and then I'll pass it off. Ari, I see you're here from E3 too. And I think from a higher level, maybe you could help answer those questions. I know that just on the surface, what we need to do is to do an analysis to find out where all those cost causation topics are coming from and make sure that we assign them accordingly. If you have a 3-phase service, then obviously it's a lot more expensive for us to provide those services and you should be paying accordingly, what your fair share is. And we do that throughout all the different, financials that we go through and allocate whatever those financials are, depending on what the user class is. In terms of the industry and the legacy stuff, that is a good question. Ari or Paul, do you want to take that, Ari?
Yeah, glad to. And I think you were really getting at this, Foster, but it really is a common practice to differentiate customer classes based on common attributes among customers within a class. And those attributes could be customer size, customer demand, voltage level, whether they're taking single phase or 3-phase service. And another common attribute that's used is the purpose of electricity consumption. Is electricity being used to meet domestic needs? Is it being used for business purposes? So these attributes and others, right? You could also imagine differentiating electricity to power electric vehicles. So all these kinds of attributes can be used by utilities to differentiate among customer classes. And then once that's done, costs are allocated to classes based on their responsibility for those costs. So all of the costs for 3-phase distribution equipment, for example, that directly serves customers, all those costs would be allocated directly to the large commercial class because that's where all that equipment actually physically is. And then, relatedly, there's a lot of equipment that's driven by customer demand. So demand determinants would be used to allocate the cost of all that equipment among the different customer classes to make sure that it's divvied up according to the class responsibility. So, and then another important reason to do this is that it subsequently allows for the development of rates that look pretty different for different classes based on different levels of customer sophistication. So historically, at least, utilities have been willing to offer much more sophisticated rates to large commercial customers with the understanding that they're better able to manage their load and better able to understand pretty complex price signals. Whereas utilities have wanted to offer much simpler rates with fewer different rate components to residential customers. But doing that requires differentiating the costs that the utility needs to recover by customer class in order to establish those rates. So we'll talk about that as we get into the next step here.
Now, I have one good question for you. So just for the sake of the audience, so we know we have a residential component, we want to allocate the cost accordingly. And on the commercial side, you'd have a demand component that's part of our current rate structure. On the residential side, there's still a demand component, even though we may not bill for it. There's certainly, on a cost of service perspective, costs that need to be covered by the residential rate class, even though that demand component's not there. Do you want to touch on that kind of thought?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that the cost allocation works is that it ties different utility costs to their actual cost driver. So a significant share of the infrastructure costs are tied to demand because it's demand rather than sales that drives those costs. Whereas the cost of purchased power will be driven much more by sales. So costs are characterized based on their cost driver, and that all factors into the cost allocation. So a significant share of the residential costs are driven by demand. And it's actually that demand determinant that's used to allocate and ultimately calculate those residential costs. But then subsequently in the rate design step, the utility can make the decision, just because costs are driven by demand, they don't necessarily have to be recovered through a demand charge. There's a lot more leeway in rate design as long as the utility can recover the residential costs from its residential customers. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility in how rates can be designed to balance among competing objectives, including policy goals, the goals of having rates that are understandable for customers, and then maybe the competing objective of having rates that are actually reflective of some of these cost drivers. So these different objectives can be in conflict to some extent, and there's a balance that's taken into account in the rate design step. Whereas the cost of service study is really meant to be a cost-based evaluation based on the specific cost drivers.
Yeah,
That makes sense. But what it means to me that as we do the rate design, when we look at the residential, we do have residential people with three-phase service at 600 amps or more because they have, they have a in their garage, they're running business and things like that. We may need to add that in because right now we treat every customer residential one exactly the same, and they're really not. That may be something we need to look at as we move further this process.
And Ari, this is Rick. You've just confirmed what I expected, which is that this is a very complex process. It is not as simple as using 5 kilowatts cost X. And, it just doesn't go down that path. I'm not disagreeing with it. I just wanted to understand all the components in there. I think Brian is right when he said there's a fair amount of social engineering in here. And I think that is true. Allowing small users on the residential who we will assume are lower income to get a better rate than the folks using large amounts of residential is pretty common around the country as far as I can tell. But on top, it also is helped to remove some of the regressive atmosphere of that. So anyway, just a comment that it is super complex, and I get it.
Yeah, I think that's all right. And I might just say one thing about that, which is that the goal in the cost of service piece is really to reflect the underlying economics. And then I absolutely agree that many utilities will then implement changes in the rate design piece to try to accomplish certain public policy goals. And that can often mean intentional subsidies for certain customer groups that are paid by other customer groups, right? Whether that's a subsidy for low-income customers to support affordability, whether that's a subsidy for large commercial businesses, right, to support jobs growth and economic development. So that rate design step is where those public policy goals and potential subsidies are generally introduced.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight that as well. There's no real social engineering on the cost of service side of it. It's really just trying to get that cost causation components and assigned, and then really jump in deep into the rate classes that we're looking at when we look at the tariffs. But good observations, Rick. And with that, why don't we go to the next chart? I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, Paul or Ari.
Sure, happy to jump in here, and just this slide here is meant to provide the bridge between the COSA and the rate design process, and just give an overview of the overall process. So yeah, on the left chart there, that's intended to reflect the output of the COSA that gets passed into the rate design process. So that's showing the total costs allocated to the different customer classes that we then need to collect those costs via rates. And as Ari was mentioning, there's a number of different rate design goals that need to be taken into account during the rate design process. So a few of those identified during this phase have been making sure that the fixed costs are fairly collected among customer classes, since a significant portion of Opalco's costs are fixed costs. Want to make sure that the financial health of the utility is maintained, that Opalco can collect the sufficient revenue to meet the costs. Ensuring customer affordability is another very important goal, and also supporting both customer understanding of rates and also, the ease of implementation of the rates from the utility side. So given all those goals, and in order to collect, the costs identified in the COSA, you can think of this as a kind of a few stage process. There's three components of the rates, broadly. There's a fixed customer charge. There's a demand-based charge that can vary, charge your peak load. And then there's a volumetric charge. So, one way you can go about this is, think about, what would be an appropriate customer charge to apply, and what would be an appropriate demand charge to apply, and then kind of what's the remaining volumetric charge that needs to be assessed in order to recover the remaining costs. As part of this process, we're planning to conduct, a bill impact analysis to look at the impacts of these different rate designs across a wide range of, typical customers for Opalco. And that can help us understand, how these rates are, impacting customers and meeting these different goals that we've assessed. And we can look at, many different designs of rates and kind of do an iterative process in order to identify the ones that best align with Opalco's goals. And so the kind of the stage right now is trying to identify a priority list of rates that we want to evaluate further in this work.
Thanks, Paul. Let's go to the next page. The next page, what we're trying to do here is we had a pretty long laundry list that we started with E3 with different rate components, right? As we break into the tariffs, what do we need to focus on? And we get into trying to narrow the topics down a little bit so we could really dive down deep, but we take off the rate components that we really don't, if we don't think we're going to go forward with them, we'd sure hate to waste the time and resources doing a really deep dive analysis on those. And let me give you for instance, and it was number 7 on the list is TOU. I think the world of time of use rates, I really do. But the more that we talk about it as a team and we talk about it with our power provider, Bonneville, as well as PNGC, we don't see the cost of basically the billing determinants on a time basis that are readily available for us. I mean, on a high level, you can find out if you have coincidental peaks and some other things, but developing a time of use rate, depending on if you know when you're going to be using really expensive power versus what our current rate structure with Bonneville. I think for this next, for the rate design that we're looking at for the next 4 years, because we will repeat this in the next 4 years, I think we're good to not go down the time of use rate. So we start to see some more cost-driven drivers that are based on time that we could allocate those out. But I think crossing that one off the list would save us a lot of time. But wanted to make sure that we got the buy-in of the board before we made that determination. I think coming through the other cost drivers that we're looking about, if there's anything else on the list that is something that, well, it'd be nice to know that, but it's really not critical to what we're going to be looking at as we're fine-tuning the cost components, we'd sure like to hear about them now. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Vince.
Yeah, I'd invite the board to ask questions at this point in time. You got some hot buttons, you like a particular one or you hate something, speak up.
Well, I personally think we have to keep number 5 on the list because I believe that we've committed to at least study it. So I'd like to keep number 5. And I think we need to study at least one of the peak demand rates.
Right, and number 3 or number 4, we should talk about what would be the right way to do it for us.
I know I would personally like to see, and I know we're trying to keep the scope tight, but I think if we're going to study demand, we should study 3 and 4 so we can see the differences. I think it is the con there on number 4. It is harder to understand. Rolling periods are going to be difficult for somebody to look at their bill and understand. But I'd like to see what, because part of this is going to be looking at sample bills, right?
Right.
And I'd like to see what the difference between 3 and 4 really is, if we could. So how do other people feel?
I think that makes sense. And one of the things I'd like to see is what it'll actually impact for some selection of members.
You bet. You bet. Exactly.
I agree with that.
I'm glad that you touched on that. So what we have normally done, and provide us with a list if you can come up with anything, just let us know. But we always like to look at what happens when we make these adjustments to a particular class, like low income members. We know who the people that are on energy assistance program. We do it before and after, like what happens with a current rate structure versus what we're proposing. And then we see the rate impact that goes along with it. Because our goal really isn't to overburden any particular rate class. It's really try to figure out what's fair and equitable going forward according to our, our goals. And so I really like that. We're going to be looking at low income. We do look at low users. We look at high users. We look at some of the seasonal folks, and we can get a good sense for what's going on with the general rate when we look at half a dozen to a dozen different rate options or rate people that are impacted.
Wendy, are you?
She's frozen.
She
No, we
froze.
just keep saying that. No, we just keep saying that. Okay. Whoops.
Yeah.
Hang on a sec.
Feedback.
Okay,
there.
I have to talk through my phone. My problem is I'm having problems with my internet connection here. So, yeah. But at any rate, we always think of residential as being a single residence. And I think one thing that's come up is because so much of our charge is in the monthly hookup fee, and we have a lot of places where there's a single meter for, a fairly high number of residences. And I know with things that are getting built like P-Patch right now, they want to have a single meter for all of their residences, that we need, I think, some way to articulate that in our rate structure. So that we're correctly spreading the fees, and so that people building apartment buildings aren't thinking, okay, here's a way to sort of game the system. We can have, lower power bills by putting 1 meter for a whole lot of units.
Yeah, I'd like to reinforce that, Wendy, because as a commercial property owner, I've got a building with 21 meters in it, and all of the tenants in there would prefer to have a single meter, and I do the work to figure out how much electricity they use. I won't do that, but there is a bunch of people who will game the system if we're not careful.
Just
Yeah. So I just
let me interrupt a little bit. There's something called a not resale component. So when you have multiple meters on one building, like Rick just brought up, that's purposeful in our rate structure today. If we want to make a change like that, I know that was a preference that was voiced by P-Patched, but I think that we need to bring that back to the board for consideration as we go through the rate process, just so you know.
No, but I know we were talking about like working housing at Roach Harbor. I think there are some places, and I don't know exactly how they're set up, where there's a single meter for a large number of units. I don't know that that's true. I'm just wanting to kind of pull that thread through here while we're talking about our classes.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, Wendy? I'm really glad that you brought that up. Is we see anomalies every once in a while. Somebody will put worker housing in an area without us really knowing it, or they'll convert it. And this gives us an opportunity to go back through our database and make sure we clean up those concepts that we all agree on. I just want to make sure it's very purposeful that that we have some not resale power for those kind of instances, and we need to clean that up anyway. And if we do find that there's different residential users that are doing that, we probably need to fix that as well, either depending on whatever the direction is the board wants to do.
Okay, thanks.
You bet.
Yeah, let me jump in too, because I sent y'all a 23-page screed on time of use and demand response and stuff like that. So my feelings are amplified to the whatever we do, we ought to be able to explain why we're doing it. And it's like, we're just trying to make more money. Do we have a community benefit reason for doing something? But to be able to explain why it happens. And the reason I did is because I've been looking at this stuff, and I took my own bill and did with and without solar, with and without time of use, with and without demand response and stuff. And I tried the experiment of saying, I'm going to impose these new structures, but I'm going to make the thing start out with neutral, In other words, I started out with my current bill and I put various components and stuff on there. And what I found is that sticking in any of these things creates vast new uncertainties in an individual's bill and our total. And to the point where like 30% of the total is going to be based on a 1 hour peak once a month. I can't even wrap my mind around trying to explain that to people. And so if you read my screed, there's lots and lots of detail about what, and these things have been in process for years, time of use, demand response, industrial and residential, so on and so forth. And there's a big difference between imposing it and making it voluntary, because when it's done voluntarily, you've seen across the nation really low acceptance responses and people check in and they check out. So
Right.
As Rick said, this stuff is really complicated, and I think we need to be really careful about it, because without price signals, which I don't think we're going to get until we start buying large portions of our power from the market, and then it's like, Katie bar the door, it's going to be the Wild West. I don't see a sense of urgency. I think care is warranted at this point in time.
I definitely agree with that. I'm not saying we should impose any of these alternative rates. I'm saying that we said we were going to go and collect the data so that we could explain to everybody what the different options are and why we were adopting them or not.
Agreed.
Right.
Absolutely agree.
So
Vince, could I jump in here?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for that, however many page screed it was. So it's so well thought out, and you brought out most of the essential details that go into this whole thing. But I've been listening to this discussion this morning, and there is one overriding unifying factor here that, when most of our membership really can't get most of the components that are involved, we want to be able to stress this up front, is that we're a not-for-profit organization, and that these rate designs are driven by that very structure. We can't charge a profit margin, even though we have a margin built in to the structure. So those are the kind of things we've got to be able to convince our lay membership, if you like, because the vast majority of people are not going to get into the level of detail that we do. And I think we got to be careful or cognizant of the fact that, we're much more proficient in knowing what these terms mean and why they should be there and all that kind of thing. But don't let's forget the message that this is a not-for-profit, therefore we are not charging anything over and above the raw costs of providing that service.
Thank you, Jerry. I mean, really, this is we want it to be an equitable process, not winners and losers. So that's really important for us as a not-for-profit co-op to make sure that we communicate to our members, because I think there is some misconception there. Thank you.
Yeah, let's make that the starting point, really.
I think that's really important, Foster, and I think you can amplify that, because I think as we discovered, there's a element, I don't know if it's in the RCWs or the WACs, that's the revised code of Washington or the Washington Administrative Code. We can't apply arbitrary and capricious rate structures. In other words, we can't just decide all blue houses will pay more than green houses. This can say, well, I'm sorry, but Washington state law doesn't allow us to do that. So we got to be mindful of that too.
Right. I think that's really important. That's where I look at it as a good opportunity for us to do that cleanup. I've already mentioned it before, but just to add some more color on it. When we do a cost of service analysis, we want to make sure that people pay the fixed cost of the grid and so forth. So we need to be very purposeful if we're going to allow like 1 meter to cover multiple units, because that's how we collect those fixed parts of the grid. And everybody needs to be part of that. So anyway, there's some great opportunities for us to get on the same page, and we're going to be bringing those forward to the board for clarification as we fine tune all of our cost components. So
one thing I'd like to go back to is in our community, how important it is to help low-income members. But that's not a rate design issue. And we've talked about this many times. You can't tell how what's an income is by reading their meter. And we have this wonderful program called Energy Assistant, and we maybe need to be doing more on that. That's something we should do, but that's not a rate design issue. And sometimes people mix those together. They have to be separated.
Brian, I really like that. I mean, the history of Opalco is that we're very transparent on our rates. And if we have a program, we need to be very transparent on what the program is. So we've made it a line item on everybody's bill. They know exactly what that payment is for the energy assistance program, and keeping it out of rates so it doesn't get convoluted. Otherwise, you start losing the whole equity component of the rate structure and why individual components work the way they do. So thanks for bringing that up, Brian. I really appreciate it.
We got a question in the chat from Rick. He does have his hand raised, so I don't know if we want to, if his question is going to get fully addressed in the comments or not.
We could have our open up for member comment after the board discussion too, because it looks like we have a couple members who want to make comments if the board is done with their discussion.
Let me try to summarize it. I think this would probably answer Rick's. We got a lot of more work to do. We got a lot more touches. Please stay engaged. The goal was just to make sure that we had the amount of rate components that we want to study in depth on the page. And then we'll have a lot more discussion on each and every one of these things, and the cost causation components and equity comparisons and comparisons to individual member bills and so forth. So I think we got what we need. I love the conversation, and I think that we will continue that on as we get into the specific rate design.
So to be specific, are we agreeing to take 7 off of the list? Is that what?
That
the net,
at least our staff's recommendation.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Does that sound reasonable to you, Mark?
I'm totally fine with that. I'd like to see some of the others, but I'm fine with the rationale for taking 7 off the list.
Yeah, we had some other ones that we were debating, but I think that was the bigger one that was going to cause us a lot of excess work and really wasn't going to produce.
Yeah, I mean, are you debating number 6? Whether number 6 is useful, or?
I think it'll play itself out. I think that one's easier to calculate than 7.
Yeah,
so.
that's fine. I don't see any reason not to do number 6, but.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then, what your comment on, I was debating whether or not the 2 different kinds of demand, but I don't think that's a big effort, Paul or Ari, if you want to chime into the difference between the coincidental peaks.
I think it's important to look at the 2 of them, because I think non-coincidental peak is like an absurd thing to explain to people.
I think I think, Vince, your discussion of this was excellent. I think the data from studying 3 and 4 are going to be important to explaining to people why adding demand charges now may not get the right result. Right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Right. I don't think we're necessarily going to get a slam dunk out of studying those that says we should do those. I think it's going to give us data to have a conversation.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I'll add one thing on this, which is that we were speaking with Krista and the communications team, and something we were talking about is how other utilities have been considering communicating to customers their monthly demand levels before imposing a demand charge. And just starting to put the monthly demand level on the customer bill. So it's something that folks have time to get accustomed with and to kind of see what their demand level is month to month, include a lot of communications about what that means, how it's measured, but then assess it at an initial rate of $0 a kW. So it's not actually contributing to the customer bill. And then once folks are accustomed to it, there can be a decision at a later point about introducing a non-zero demand charge.
Good point, Ari. Thank you. So I think we got what we need. We're going to not go forward with a lot of detail behind number 7, but we'll keep all the rest of the rate components on the list.
Cool.
Vince, are you good with that?
Yeah, I am. I'll just go back to my screed again, which, I mean, I hate to beat it, but you've got to understand, why are we doing this? And my studies says, that if you looked across the results of the studies that I looked at and utilities and stuff like this, they're trying to do something. It's not clear what they're trying to do, and they're not getting the results. So the time of use and the demand things that have been implemented across the utilities crisis has not resulted in a decrease in demand nor a shift in behaviors. So you got to understand, if we're doing this stuff, what is it we think is actually going to happen, and what proof do we have that it's going to? And that's basically all I'm asking for, because it's easy to implement any of these things. You might be able to explain it, but then does it actually produce the results you're hoping for is a big open question.
Right. And I think we have heard from people in the community that want us to do certain things rate-wise, right?
Yes.
And, and have written articles about it, et cetera. And I think that we need to, when we discuss why we will or won't do that, we need to be armed with the data to show them, A, what effect it has, and B, why it will not have, possibly not have the effect on overall consumption patterns that they expect.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. I don't think the results of, to me, studying these things is not necessarily just because some of them are viable options. It's about demonstrating why they may not yet be viable options.
Absolutely. I think that's going to be an important communication vehicle, because I believe there's a mythology that all of these things actually work, and it's why aren't you doing it immediately?
Right. Right. Well, I mean, those of us who have been in the industry for a long time, demand response, does it work? Right.
No.
Right. Exactly. We've been talking about demand response for decades, and, apart from large factories, it doesn't seem to have any effect anywhere.
Yep.
I want to just add one quick thing to this conversation, which is about the importance of stating the utilities goals for these rate changes. And I think that's broadly aligned with what I'm hearing from you both. And that there are actually two pretty different goals that could drive some of these changes. And one is encouraging customer behavioral response, right? And that could be a reasonable goal. And I think you're right, it's important to look at studies that indicate to what extent these kinds of rate changes drive behavioral changes in customers and different customer groups. But a different but also important utility goal is to make sure that the utility is able to recover its fixed costs, even in a warmer weather year. And that, that's another valid goal that could suggest some of these rate changes could be beneficial, regardless of whether they drive customer behavioral changes, but just in terms of ensuring that the utility is able to recover its costs. So yeah, we'll make sure that all of this is really tied clearly into what are the objectives that these rate changes are trying to address.
Great.
Good. Yes. And I do think there is a difference. I like what you just said, because I think that there are the folks who are asking us to make certain kinds of rate changes are looking for behavioral change.
Right.
And our goal is to make sure our biggest goal is to make sure that we are sustainable through all of the demand components, the changes in the electricity supply, the changes in the economics of that supply. And so, yes, we have slightly different goals we need to talk to members about.
I appreciate that, Mark. And Rick, you brought up the rooftop solar. I can either talk to you offline, or I guarantee we're going to be dealing with some of the details as we go through this rate analysis. So I think stay tuned for now. How's that?
There may have been another member question about this topic. Stephen Burnham, did you have a question? You had your hand raised for a second.
Yeah, thanks for that. I didn't see that one.
Is he still here? Maybe he left. Or no, he's here. Okay, well, I didn't see. I guess maybe he doesn't have a question anymore. We'll open it up again at the end.
Oh, hello.
Oh, hi. Okay. Oh, wait, you muted again. You're there. Almost.
How about that?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, thanks. And as you say, I don't really follow the details of the rate structure, but I just wanted to make two comments from a member. One, I am very, very concerned that Opalco does not seem to me to be pushing the conservation and use reduction angle very much. And I don't even know whether this is related to this topic, but I'd really like to see system-wide reduction goals and individual use goals too. You seem to be saying that it's very mysterious how to achieve those, but I still think that Opalco doesn't have a local goal of reducing users' use. And the second thing I wanted to say is, what was it? Well, I guess that was the other thing was, just as an aside, off the topic somewhat, I would like to see more encouragement of member participation in the decision making somehow with, focus groups or maybe you've already done this and I just haven't responded myself, but I'd like to see more member engagement and more member action to be able to bring to the board the sincere concerns of the membership. And I'm not sure at present whether the membership interests or the interests that you just outlined, that is meeting every electric demand that comes to your door, is the more important goal. So that's just what I wanted to say. I would like to see more organized reduction in use encouragement and programs. And I'd like to see more encouragement from the board to get members involved in the decision making. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, Steve, if I can touch on one at a time there, I'd love to. What's interesting is our ears are open. We have laws and restrictions that we have to follow. The one on kind of setting policy, it's really interesting for us. We want everybody to use electricity as opposed to, gasoline in their car. If you switch over from an EV over to an EV from a gas car, we lose, the carbon attributes are the big benefit. The most efficient, motors and energy use is electricity. And we want to encourage that. And it's really interesting because if you want to encourage that, you want to keep your kilowatt hour charges pretty low so people fuel switch away from whatever those components are, so they really optimize that. And then you compare that to trying to embrace solar, right? And say you want to embrace solar, your kilowatt hour people, if you get too low, the people that own the solar are going to be a little frustrated that their kilowatt hour charge, if they were higher, they'd be saving a lot more on their bill. So it's really an interesting dilemma that we're faced with, trying to electrify as much of the components as we can because it's an efficient use of power. But we're also want to make sure that our solar rates are consistent and equitable and so forth. So those interesting trade-offs that you bring up, and love your participation and tell as many people as you can about our rate analysis and so we could really get some good dialogue going in our board meetings is really helpful for us. And we do put the word out, and we'll do some town halls on rate structure and some other things. So really appreciate your feedback.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're done with rates for now.
All right. So what's the next checkpoint, or when we will be, see some intermediate results, or how's the schedule look on this?
I think our next one is we're going to do our next check in May. Is that right, Paul?
That's we can coordinate about when would make most sense, but we were targeting to really hit the ground running now that we've aligned on the rates and start producing our analysis. So we are targeting to be able to share in May, but we can circle up with you and see when would work best.
Great.
That answers the question. Thank you for that.
Okay.
We also have
right.
one more question in the chat here. Sorry, but has EV use, non-use been considered in the cost allocation design from Mirren?
I know that we're going to be doing, let's see, in the tariff side, that's what we're about to jump into. So we haven't done any analysis on the tariff side. So we've done the cost of service study, and now we're just about to get into the details. And one of those discussions is going to be about EV adoption and, you know, all the tariff and specifics that go along with that. So stay tuned.
Okay. Well, Paul and Ari, thank you so much for helping us out with this. You know, it's a complex, difficult task, and I think we're in good hands with you. So appreciate your work.
Yeah, thanks you guys.
Thanks all.
And your team. You got a good team behind you too. So well done.
All right, Foster.
Let's see here, annual meeting travel arrangements. I think everyone's excited about tomorrow's member meeting. I know our staff are. Here's the logistics for the ferry. We just wanted to remind everybody about the logistics. SIA goes from 3 to 6.
Super. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. Here's our part. We don't have to spend much time on this. We had a good discussion at the last board meeting about all these specifics. We've been spending most of our time getting ready for our annual meeting. High marks to everything Krista and Joe and Beth have been doing to organize everybody in member services. You're going to see some, you know, our alignment over there as well. It's going to be an exciting day for us.
Could you pause back on the Switch It Up program?
God, I love those
Yeah,
stats. I was look at the stats that I see are just phenomenal. When you see of all the energy efficiency components, look in total, $21 million or almost 22.
Yeah.
In total. And then you have 9 million associated with solar. Those are the last, you know, 2 of the last 3. And then the balance of the, you know, 11 million 7 is for all the efficiency that we've done. This has been one of the best programs we could ever imagine. Really to get to, it's one thing to encourage your member to be, you know, efficient and use their homes wisely. It's another thing to have programs that actually are available to get that efficiency level in there. So
My question was going to be on the energy storage class. That is just, those are projects that are only battery storage without a solar component, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And are we just not seeing any this year so far, or?
We just haven't seen any standalone energy storage this year.
Interesting.
You know, that is, you know, by the way, one of the things that Travis and I spent a lot of time through is the REST program. And the federal government is such in disarray right now, and it's really kind of sad. But one of the things that we're pushing for is another tranche, right? We got 26 million left remaining in our Switch It Up programs. But one of the things you're touching on, Mark, is what we want to spend a lot of analysis to go with it is if we can get more batteries in the hands of our members, that would be a big win too. If we're saying that the grid is becoming a little precarious, which we are, batteries could pay a really big dividend back to our membership. And we're thinking that the best program that we could do is get another tranche of Switch It Up funds to encourage that.
Yeah.
But I think we also have to do it. It's pretty obvious that we need to have a good communication campaign that goes with it.
So one of the things about energy storage, and we've talked about this a little bit, is that some of us don't have a place to put the battery.
Might make it more challenging to fall asleep. Avoid prolonged use of light, emitting screens.
Sorry.
It is challenging to fall asleep.
Yes. Is where to put it. My wife won't let me put the batteries in the living room. And so one of the things we've talked about is, can you put a box just on the outside of your house?
Yeah.
And what would that count? Because that might make it easier for some people to put that in, but they can't fit it in their house now.
Yeah, you know, one of the Russell and I were talking about yesterday is coming up with, you know, if the Switch It Up tranche comes into play and we could do it in a meaningful way, I would see that if we can come up with a battery, and I think they make some weather cased hardened systems that you could put next to your meter base. Right? And if that would be probably the easiest install you can imagine. Now it's still going to require you know, the easiest thing to do would be to do that, except for then you got to manage your breakers, you know, individually.
Yeah.
If you had a transfer switch and you had it all organized, that's the way to go. But like you, Brian, I was thinking of the same thing. I was like, I'd rather just put the battery over there and then turn off different breakers and keep my refrigerator, freezer on just so I didn't lose any food. That would be a big win for me.
If you already have a generator wired into a panel, you know, then swapping in battery there, you're already structurally set up for it. But otherwise, it is a lot of work, like you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think we need to be a little dynamic there, but if we can come up with 3 options or something, if you're a new build, it's probably pretty easy. If you're like, there's a handful of people that have generators out there, that would be a pretty easy install. And then I think the one that would serve an existing home would be something at the meter based, but it's a little more manual oriented. But that would be a big win. And I think that would help our members navigate through an intermittent period when the grid goes down. Now it's not going to be, it's not going to last that long. So you got to, your batteries have to be taken into consideration. What we really need is a combination of everything. We need to get utility scale, solar, combine it with batteries like we have on Decatur. That's the biggest win.
I had 2 other small questions here. It seemed like EV chargers in 2025, you just look at the average monthly that we did in 2024, and it looks like it's really slowed down in 2025. And switch it up use for fiber as well, it seems to be underperforming in 2025. Is that just because people haven't started projects, or is there a reason why those are down?
Well, the EV chargers, for a long time it was tough to find an electrician to install them. So I still think there's some demand for the EV chargers.
Okay, there is that. Yeah,
a little bit, and then when it comes to the fiber, I think that what we see on the fiber is we got a lot of those ARPA funding grants that are 100% connection. So we don't see the switch it up and being as needed. It's still going to be an essential connection going forward. As soon as, if you're outside, like say that you need to have some financial support, which this would provide, and you're not part of that ARPA grant area within your service territory, this is a great win. And I think that'll probably pick right back up as soon as we get done concentrating on the ARPA.
I hope so. I hope so, because if you just look at the average, we were doing about 7,000 a month in fiber last year. Right. So that is a little bit of a decline. I just wondered why.
I think Alan's out there, or he was. I don't know if he's still there or not. Alan, are you out there? If you want to chime in or not. I think he already.
Yeah, he's already left.
Yeah, he's around for the Q&A. I know that's going to be essential. Alan and I were talking about it yesterday about how critical it is to go forward with that side of it.
Great. I think that'd be a good conversation for our next meeting, our quarter meeting with that work, because I think one of the bigger issues is the middle mile. I think that's a blocker.
Yeah, we have, by the way, we're also looking at BEAD funding and some other really great internet related grant stuff that still may be available, believe it or not. Everything else is dried up except for that. So we'll be dynamic when it comes to that. But this is going to be, I think you're going to see that number go up pretty dramatically next year, for instance.
Foster, is BEAD a federal or a state program, or both?
It's kind of both. It's
federal money that the state administers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, it's not nearly as good as the ARPA. The ARPA funds were wonderful. That was where we got a $50 million grant to hook up, large portions of Decatur Center, a little bit of Mount Dallas and some other areas. BEAD funding is a lot, is a lot less funded, but will still benefit us tremendously when we need help reaching those really expensive areas.
Got it.
I know Tom's got something in the chat about the technical issues associated with storage retrofit. Those are interesting to note. So make sure you read that chat before we go away.
I think that's part of why you're not seeing a whole lot of funding use, is it really implies a replacement or retrofit, a new inverter system to bolt on the storage piece of it. And there's also some National Electric Code changes in terms of panel sizing and ampacity, depending on how much solar production there is to the inverter. And there's also a reserved capacity now for EV charging loads that has to be factored in. That's all really for new builds, not a retrofit situation. But there is a lot more available storage, residential storage options on the market. Prices have come down, and there are outdoor wall-mounted versions, indoor versions. So there's a lot more flexibility on how you can install them. So I think that's a great topic to know more about, and then figure out how to fund that more aggressively in the future.
Do you know of a good one that could be on a kind of the meter-based side? Do you think that's an option for us?
The ones I've seen are deployed right next to the meter base if it's on the building, and there's usually a gateway that connects to the main service that feeds AC power from the inverter and storage back. Opalco has a lot of remote meters where the
Right.
meter, and disconnect, main master disconnect, service entrance, all that is some distance from the house. I think the rules are no more than 100 to 150 feet away. So that makes it a little bit more complicated, because now you're putting together an inverter and storage system quite some distance from the house where the actual meter is. But I think it would be good to study this a little bit more and figure out how to encourage adoption of more storage, and go through some of the technical details.
Yeah, thanks for your wisdom, Tom. Always appreciate it.
Yeah, that might help me.
Anything else, Mark? Thanks for bringing up our Switch It Up burger.
That's good.
Thank Alignment Month.
Yes.
We're gonna have the Earth Ball tomorrow, just so you guys know. Any other questions? I think that's about it. I think you guys are pretty up to speed.
All right. So we got any additional public comments at this time? Chris, did you see anything?
Did we talk about the first read?
Foster.
Where is that?
Actually, I think it got taken out and then we didn't put it back in, I don't think. We might have to do that next month.
Well, there was a rate goal section that we had on there for the first read that Joel was helping with.
Oh, maybe, is that on the public site?
Why don't you pull that one up if it
I'm
is?
not sure.
Yeah, let me look and see what's in the document.
It's there. Let me.
We might have just passed through it because it was pretty minor.
Oh, yeah, okay, because I didn't see it when in my little.
The version that originally went out is not the most recent one.
Okay.
I think we
don't see it on the website, so I think we didn't make it public. Even though we did include it in our agenda we sent out. So.
We'll bring that back.
Why don't you bring it back in May?
Yeah, we'll do it.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
What we're talking about is really it kind of leads in well with one of the discussion points with RE and E3 about coming up with what are our goals, or what are our marching orders that we have in our rate structure according to law and rules and so forth.
Right.
So having those highlighted gives us a lot of direction going forward. What I'll do is I'll send out a little something mid-month just to make sure that there was concurrence on that, and then we'll bring it back in May.
Okay. All right. I think then that'll be it. So let's close out the regular board meeting session at this point. We'll stop our recording, and it's 10 o'clock. I think we got an executive session, Foster, is that correct?
Right.
So why don't we come back